Good evening, everyone, to this Metaforum Actualiteitscollege Current Events Lecture on Autocracy versus Democracy. Before we move to the lecture, let me give you a few introductory notes very briefly. I'm Helder De Schutter, I'm a professor of philosophy and dean of the faculty. This lecture is organized by Metaforum, KU Leuven's interdisciplinary think tank, and the mission of Metaforum is to make the university's wealth of scholarly knowledge and expertise available to both policymakers and the general public for a societal public debate. To do so, Metaforum does many things. One of them is to set up working groups with specialist academics from different disciplines on a variety of topics. There are also lunch discussions on Thursdays, and there are lectures on important issues such as this one tonight, which only takes place twice a year. Let me turn to the topic for today, what you are waiting for, and this is the fact that the aim of an evening like this one is to zoom in on one of the most pressing issues facing our societies today. And arguably, this topic is one of those central pressing issues. The question whether there is a threat to democracy, to liberal democracy, to our model of statehood. Some 3 decades ago, maybe 35 years, there was great reason after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the Soviet Union to be very positive about the outlook of democracy and liberal democracy. Some experts talked in a Hegelian fashion about the end of history, as did Fukuyama. Today it seems a lot more bleak. There are external threats to democracy as a result of the rising success of non-liberal, non-democracies, of autocracies. But most importantly for tonight, there are also internal threats to democracy from the inside. Across the world, democratic systems are challenged or tested by rising populism, by increasing polarization, by signs of institutional weakening. These developments raise crucial, urgent, political, moral, complex questions. How resilient are democracies? How should we respond to this? Democracies have been under threat before, and there are ways to fight back. What are they? What happens when the rules that sustain democratic life are pushed to their limits? And can fear, and this is one topic for tonight, pose a threat to a democracy? So tonight we'll explore these questions from multiple perspectives. We'll ask, and we'll start by that, by asking what democracy is, what a liberal or constitutional democracy is. We'll ask how to defend it. We'll examine how governance can remain effective in times of democratic backsliding. And we'll talk about the crucial role played by civil society and civil service. We'll also reflect on the responsibilities that come with political victory in a democracy and what the losers should do, what is required from those who hold power. And finally, we'll talk about this issue of the emotional human dimension, asking how emotions such as fear shape our political realities and how they might be transformed into hope in uncertain times. We have invited 4 experts from different disciplines to speak. One from political philosophy, one from public governance, one from political science, and one from psychology. First up is Professor Stefan Rummens in philosophy, political philosophy, and his lecture is called Defending Democracy, a Collective Duty. Followed by Trui Steen, Professor Steen in public governance, who will talk about governance in times of democratic backsliding and the role of civil society and civil service. Professor Sofie Marien will be the 3rd speaker in political science, whose lecture will be on victory and democracy, what democracy demands from winners. And Bram Vervliet will deliver the final lecture from psychology, and Professor Vervliet will talk about from fear to hope in an uncertain world. Each lecture will last 20 minutes, so you can mentally prepare for an hour of lectures. However, after that, there is the possibility for you to ask questions in a Q&A with the public. Metaforum has this very cool tradition that really works of engaging the public in a Q&A session, which you can access by scanning this with your phone, and then you can ask a question, you can already do that during the lecture. The system is up now already, so you could in fact already start if you wanted to do that. And I would also like to tell you that it is possible, if you ask a question that has been asked before, to upvote another question and give that question some support so that we can test some of the popularity of some of the questions. Afterwards, we'll organize this Q&A. You're welcome. We're using the lingua franca here in English. You're welcome to ask your question in any language of which you have reasonable suspicion that we might understand it, and then I'll make sure to bring it to the fore in the Q&A session. I would like to welcome Professor Rummens to the floor for the first lecture.
Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. 20 minutes is not a long time. What I want to do is, first of all, try to give some conceptual clarification, talk a bit about what is democracy, talk a bit about what is authoritarianism in its populist form I'm going to focus on. I would like to say a few things about how our democratic system works, the variety of political actors that are involved, and then end with two general recommendations that I think are important when we think about strategies for defending democracy. But so I want to start with the question, what is democracy? And if you ask people, the general response that you get, of course, is the rule of the people. And that is indeed what the Greek word also means. To be a bit more specific, in a democracy, power is legitimate to the extent that it is based on the will of the people. And that is definitely true. What is much less appreciated, however, is that there is a second principle which is at least equally important for understanding how our democratic system works. And that is the second principle that is up there. That is the fact that the people who rule themselves should be conceived of as a community of free and equal citizens. And free and equal citizens will think different things, will have different values and opinions. And so this means that a democratic people is a pluralistic community. And democracy should take that seriously and should uphold the pluralistic nature of the demos. That is absolutely essential. This means, for instance, that even though in a democracy many decisions can be made on the basis of a majority decision, the majority cannot simply do what it wants. A majority also needs to be constrained. A majority needs to respect the pluralistic nature of the democratic people at all times. And so we should think about how that works. And that is the reason why our democracy as we know it, is a liberal or constitutional democracy. Those two expressions are used interchangeably as synonyms. What this means is that we can distinguish two different dimensions in our democracy. Our democracy has a liberal dimension, which means that indeed in our democracy, individual liberty rights are essential, and they are indeed constitutionally protected. Yeah? A majority decision cannot go against the basic freedom rights of individual citizens. It means that in a democracy, the majority cannot do what it wants, it cannot abuse its powers. So democracy is based on the rule of law, is based on an idea of the separation of powers. Yeah? This is crucial. Yeah? The second dimension is this democratic dimension. And here too, the fact that our community is a pluralistic community means that we should not confuse the will of the majority with the will of the people as a whole. In a democracy such as ours, we should recognize that the people always speak with several voices, with different voices at the same time. That is what we get in our party democracy. This means that even though the majority is allowed to make decisions, the opposition is also a legitimate representative of the people and should be respected as such. The fact that our democracy is pluralistic means that democracy in many ways should be seen as an organized and ongoing contest. This means indeed that majority decisions can and should be challenged and criticized. This means that we need mechanisms in which we do that. Yeah? Here the media, of course, plays an important role. Here civil society plays an important role. Now, if this is democracy, what is its main challenger today? And so I think the main challenger today is clearly populism. Yeah? So the title of the meeting tonight is Authoritarianism versus Democracy, but I think the main authoritarian challenge that we face is the populist threat. And for me, the best way of understanding populism is by seeing how it relates to liberal democracy. And populism and democracy agree on the first principle. Populists will also say that power should be based on the will of the people. There, Democrats and populists agree. The main distinction is that populists somehow assume that the people is a homogeneous collective with a rather singular will. They seem to assume that the will of the people in the singular can be identified, and more specifically that it is embodied, represented, and voiced by the populist leader. Yeah? And so this is a kind of a conflation of the will of the majority as represented by the populist leader with the will of the people as a whole. And therefore, populists will not think that the will of the leader should be constrained. And that is why populism, and I think we've seen this in places where populism has come to power. Think of Hungary until recently, think of Poland until recently, think of Turkey, think of what is going on in the US today. I think that we can see there that that kind of populism, when it comes to power, is both illiberal and undemocratic. And that is important because Viktor Orban, for instance, recognized that he was illiberal. He often called himself an illiberal Democrat. And some of my colleagues in the academic debate went along with that definition, populism as a kind of illiberal democracy. I deeply disagree. Yeah? Populism is illiberal, that is true, but it is also undemocratic. And so we see this if you look at the two dimensions that I distinguished before. Yeah? So populism is illiberal. In populist regimes, minority rights are under pressure. Rights of asylum seekers, rights of migrants, rights of the LGBTQ community. Yeah. We see that in a populist regime, the rule of power and the rule of law, and the separation of powers is under pressure. We see that populists try to take control of the constitutional court in many different ways. So indeed, the liberal side of democracy is under pressure. But the thing is that the same holds for the democratic side. Democracy should be an organized conflict in which oppositional voices are taken seriously. The first thing that populist rulers try to do is try to undermine the opposition. Think of Trump's slogan already in 2016, Hillary for prison. Yeah? So populists don't think that the opposition is legitimate. They want to delegitimize the opposition. Populists generally delegitimize all forms of critique. Critique in the media is fake news from fake media. Populists undermine civil society because it is too critical. Populists want to take control of the media because they want to control what goes on. So in that sense, populism is not only illiberal, there Orban was right, it is also undemocratic, and there Orban was wrong. Now, democracy, if we think of how the democratic system works, one model that I find enlightening is the concentric model of democracy. And this is a model that was defended by Jürgen Habermas, a famous philosopher, one of the most important democratic theories of recent decades, who died recently. He argued democracy is a concentric system. This means that for him, we should think of democracy with parliament and government at the core. This is where the decisions are made. But importantly, democracy is not only a matter for elected representatives. The core of the system is surrounded by a public sphere in which we can all participate. In the periphery, in that public sphere, arguments are generated, topics are discussed. This is done by individual citizens, this is done by civil society organizations, this is somehow mediatized by the media. And ideally what goes on in that periphery, in the public sphere, should influence the decisions in the core. And so in that sense, democracy becomes a collective process in which we all participate. And this is of course important, yeah? So we all participate as individuals, as civil society organizations, but also educational institutions, also universities. And so when we think about how we should defend democracy, we should appreciate the fact that all of these political actors play a role, and that all of these actors therefore also have to play a part when it comes to thinking about how to defend the system, when it is challenged, for instance, from the inside out by these populist challengers. So in that sense, the title of my presentation defending democracy as a collective duty in which we all have to participate. Now, how should we then do it? How should we defend our democracy? This is, of course, a very difficult question, and academics don't have clear-cut answers, unfortunately. What I want to bring to you or propose is that I think there are two main objectives that we should take seriously. The first one is ensuring the responsiveness of the system. Yeah? When we think about the causes of populism, and also there are no very clear answers. Why is populism all of a sudden so popular amongst voters? But what comes back when we think about this is, of course, always that somehow voters don't feel adequately represented by the traditional parties. Somehow they don't have the feeling that their problems, their identity is taken seriously. They don't feel recognized. Somehow they don't have the feeling that their vote for the traditional parties makes enough of a difference. And so one of the objectives therefore should be ensure that we do take those concerns seriously, that we have democratic systems that allow us to capture all of these concerns and do something with it. From this, many things follow, and we can discuss a long time about each and all of them. I can only briefly mention them. For me, freedom of expression is very important. So I don't think that we should fight extremism by fighting extremist speech. I think that is the wrong answer. In the periphery of the system, we can handle it. Yeah? And I think it's important that we take the signals that come from hurt and angry voters seriously. So we should not try to undermine the signaling function of free speech. So for me, I think we should be very careful when we think about restricting the freedom of expression, and I think that generally it's a bad idea. What we do need, however, is a lively party landscape with political parties that try to innovate, that come with interesting ideological stories that differ enough from each other. Here, I do think that in the 1990s, with third-way politics, after the end of the Cold War, the end of the great ideologies, we have encountered a problem. Yeah? I think that the ideological differences between mainstream traditional parties are often not clear enough, not convincing enough to voters. So this really is a task for politicians and parties to try and be innovative, to try and come up with answers to the concerns of voters that at the same time remain within the parameters of what is democratically legitimate. And in this context, I do think that in Belgium, but also especially in Europe, I think we do have a problem of technocracy. It's a difficult topic, but I do think that the European Union, as it functions now, has a democratic deficit. When Brussels has decided, we, the voters, we generally don't know who that is. We generally don't know when we go out to vote for European elections, how can I express my discontent with European policy? Where is the European opposition? So the European Union does not have enough oppositional dynamics, does not provide the institutional framework that allows people to disagree with what goes on. And this is a serious problem because people feel that they cannot express their opposition to policies within the EU, and therefore their opposition turns against the EU as such. That's important, turns against democracy as such. In the US, I think the situation is a bit different. There, I think the main challenge is plutocracy. Before the Trump era, socioeconomic policies from Democrats and Republicans were hard to distinguish. Yeah? Even under Bill Clinton, you had very right-wing neoliberal policies being implemented. Voters noticed this. Yeah? And this was due, I think, to a large extent by the fact that if you want to win an election in the US, you have to have a lot of money, so you have to have a lot of sponsors, and they come from powerful economic players. And so therefore, of course, you cater to their interests rather than to the interests of your voters. Yeah? So plutocracy is also a problem when it comes to ensuring responsiveness to voters. Yeah? Another thorny topic is the problem of judiciary activism. It's also a bit on the agenda here. I'm not a full expert, but I do have some concerns about the legitimacy of some of the decisions that come from the European Court of Human Rights. How is this embedded in a democratic system? How is this embedded in a public sphere? Yeah? I think generally we need, of course, constitutional control. We need judiciary control. We need separation of powers. But when it comes, for instance, to climate cases, is it really up to the courts to make some of the important decisions? It's very difficult, it's a fine balance, but we have to be careful. A final point, also maybe interesting here, I think we should be careful also about ideological biases, for instance, when it comes to the media or when it comes to universities. One of my colleagues has recently published a book about how academics generally are much more left-wing than the average population. Yeah? And I think that's true, and I think that to a certain extent this is a problem. Yeah? We too, when we think about societal problems, we have to make sure that all perspectives are somehow represented. Yeah? That we do keep in touch with the problems that are out there experienced by voters. Yeah? So to the extent that we play a part in the democratic process, and we do, that should be a reason for concern. It's already my final slide. The other second objective that I want to present is, yes, we try to be inclusive towards the voters of potential voters of populist parties, but at the same time, we should clearly guard the democratic boundaries. Yeah? We should make sure that extremist or populist actors do not get into the core of our system, do not get the opportunity to make decisions that go against the basic principles of our democratic system. And so in that sense, when we think of democracy as a concentric model, to the extent that extremist or populist actors come closer to the core, we should be less tolerant towards them. So yes, we should allow extremist speech at the periphery of the system, but no, we should not allow these extremist actors to take power positions. That is something that we should try to prevent. How do we do that? Well, here there is a role for the judiciary, for constitutional courts. In the academic debate, there's a big debate about should we ban extremist parties, under which conditions. I think it's a relevant debate, but maybe not the most important topic. We should, I think, I have publicly defended the cordon sanitaire around Vlaams Belang in our country. I think that is a legitimate position to take. The party defends principles, ideas that go against the core principles of our democratic system, and I think that is a reason for not allowing them to take positions of power. Precisely because the democratic system is a collective process in which we all partake, we also all have duties. Yeah? So here also the role of the media, the role of civil society, the role of universities, I think we should stick up for these democratic values. We should be ideologically pluralistic. That was the first part. But when it comes to democratic values, we should be unconditional. We should commit to them. We cannot be supposedly neutral between democratic and undemocratic positions in society. That is not where we should stand. We are part of the democratic system, and therefore we should explicitly defend it. And so in that sense, I must say that I'm deeply disappointed by what we see in the United States right now, where many, if not most of the universities go on their knees for Donald Trump. They succumb to the kind of blackmail that they put on them, probably for financial reasons, but that's not good enough. Yeah? As universities, as civil society organizations, but also the media should stick up for these democratic values. So there too, the media are in the same position. They should be, in a way, ideologically neutral, to the extent that there is a left-wing bias, and I think in the media it is probably less of a problem than in the universities. I should be careful about what I say. But I think that there too, the media should not make the mistake of saying we have to remain neutral, and that extends to remaining neutral between democratic and undemocratic positions. That is a misunderstood, that is a wrongly understood idea of neutrality. In a democratic society, all of these actors should come up for these democratic values. This means, in the end, this is an expression also used by Habermas. Yeah? Habermas said, in the end, how are we going to protect democracy? And we can think about all the potential institutional mechanisms and separation of powers and constitutional review and what have you. And in the German constitution, some of our basic articles can never be amended. It's kind of trying to immunize, make the constitution immune for change. He says all of that is very well, but without a democratic culture in which citizens are convinced and understand the democratic values and are prepared to fight for them, it is not going to work. So the democratic culture has to meet the institutions halfway. The institutions and the laws and the regulations in themselves cannot make it work. So that is why this general democratic culture is absolutely essential, that we should all try to understand what democracy is and try to understand that it is more than the will of the majority. It is much more than that. I think I'm almost at the end of my time, so this is just a very brief summary. Democracy is liberal democracy, and this is because the people, the democratic people, is a pluralistic community of free and equal citizens. It is not, as populists assume, a homogeneous collective with a singular will. That is illiberal and undemocratic. Democracy is a concentric system with many different players that have to take up their role and have to take up responsibility. And when we think about defending democracy, yes, we should cater to the legitimate concerns of potential populist voters. We have to be inclusive when it comes to that. We have to try and be as responsive as possible. But at the same time, we should guard the boundaries and try to prevent at all costs that they come to power. I end it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this introduction on democracy and the role of the collective. And I think I'm following up quite easily on this, as actually I want to focus on two major stakeholders within this collective and their role. One of them is civil society. So what is civil society and what is the role of civil society in a democratic environment? The other one, which I want to focus on as a public administration scholar, is civil service, the administration. What is their role? Why are they important within a democracy? Following up on that, I also want to discuss the idea of primacy of politics, as this is an idea that is raising popularity also here within a Flemish or a Belgian context, and it links with how Stefan just explained what is democracy, but also what is not democracy, that it's more than simply the will of the people, that there's more to that. And so I want to question what is the impact of that idea of primacy of politics also on civil society and public service. Okay. So what is civil society? Very briefly, we talk about government, the state, we talk about the market, the private sector, business organizations, and next to that, sometimes we also call it the third sector. In Dutch, middenveld is also a term that's often used, civil society. So all organizations that are somewhere next to, on the one hand, government, and on the other hand, the market. Why is civil society so important in our democracy? Well, very basically said, you can say it has two roles, civil society. One is advocacy, defending interests of specific groups in society, and within our context, if I in some of the examples I will give, I focus back on Flanders and Belgium, but of course it's broader than that. But specifically within our context here in Flanders and in Belgium, we are a neo-corporatist environment where we do give a specific focus, for example, in social relations, but also in policies on healthcare, for example. There's a number of specific actors which are having a specific role in advising governments in debating. But there's also what we call the outsiders. Think about an organization like Greenpeace, for example, which is also there defending a specific interest as a civil society organization, advocating for a specific interest. Next to that, next to the role of defending specific interests of a group or specific groups on a specific team, there's also a very important role of civil society in actually providing public services. Again, if you think about healthcare, or if you think about education, if you think about policies on poverty, for example, you immediately see how many of the organizations that are very important there are not public organizations, or not strictly seen government organizations, but are organizations from civil society that take up a role in providing what we see as services for the public, as public services. Those two roles and civil society taking these up, why is this important within a democratic within that idea of a liberal democracy? Well, for different reasons. One reason you could say is the idea that it encourages partnership, encourages participation of organized citizens, but also of individual citizens. It is civil society often is a tool to for example, through volunteering, to engage citizens, to make people meet other people within their own group, but also across different groups. It is a means also for debate, through that interest representation, to activate people, to call for social change, to challenge government and politics for social change. That's also an important role. Representing the unrepresentative. A number of civil society organizations are very broad. A number of civil society organizations are specifically linked with groups, specific groups in society, with minority groups. Think about socio-ethnic organized civil society organizations, for example. They defend the interest of specific groups of, if Stefan just said, democracy is not simply the will of the majority. They have a specific role also in showing these minority concerns and in advocating for also the interests of groups, minority groups, groups that are often difficult to access for governments. So often they're also a bridge between government and specific groups in society. And then lastly, an important task or role of civil society is also balancing powers, making sure that state power is not authoritarian, that rules are followed. They advocate for transparency. If there's abuse, they have a role in showing, in making visible mismanagement or abuse by government, if that is the case. So yes, civil society has an important role. I'm not only talking about civil society, I'm also talking about the civil service, about our government administrations who also have a role within our democratic system. So what I'm talking about here, the administration, so the professionals working in government at different layers of government, local government, regional government, state government, European government, that carry out the laws and the policies that implement the decisions that are made by politics. Again, what is the role of these civil service administrators within our democracy? Providing expertise and make sure that policy is evidence-based, is evidence-informed. So the role of government, of politicians, is to make laws, to make policies. The administration has a role to make sure that they are implemented in a correct way, but also to make sure that their expertise is taking into account how can you make an ideological idea into a realistic policy that can be implemented. Ensuring continuity and stability. Politics is by definition something that every election cycle, there's new politicians coming up with new ideas, wanting to manifest them. Also important, bringing out change. At the same time, there's also some stability needed. There's long-term challenges that we have. So there's also a role of the administration to show how policies build upon other policies, how these long-term interests also keep being taken into account. Enforcing rule of law, making sure that by implementing policies, this is done according to the rule of law, that policies are implemented evenly, fairly across across the whole population, a very important aspect in government. We should all be treated equally through law, so that's also important to assure, and linked to that, in ensuring accountability to procedures. There are many procedures. Bureaucracy is often linked with slow procedures, but that has a reason, of course, again, to ensure that everybody is treated equally, to ensure that rule of law is followed. Another element in ensuring this accountability for a civil service is providing information to the parliament, for example, so that the parliament in turn can control, the executive can control the government in how it implements policies. And I think this also links with what Stefan just had said. In that way, the administration is more than simply an instrument of the elected leadership that says, now we have the majority, now we do whatever we want. The government, the civil service, is also there to say, yes, but laws has to be followed, the rule of law has to be followed, longer-term perspectives have to be taken into account. And also, that's also why we talk about speaking truth to power, or sometimes we also call it loyal contradiction. We expect from our administrators, we expect from our top administrations who directly talk to the ministries that they speak truth to power, that they say, if you want to implement these policies, this is what can happen, this is how it needs to be done if we follow the constitution, if we follow the procedures, to make sure that we do this in a democratic way. As I said in my introduction, I want to sort of contrast this with the idea of primacy of politics. In Dutch, it's often in the media also, het primaat van de politiek. And it's a bit similar to what Stefan just said. If you explain democracy in a very basic way, that idea of it's the will of the majority. And this is in a way also that same translation, the idea, the primaat van de primacy of politics is that idea that popular sovereignty, and there's a chain of command. We have been elected, so now we are the ones to decide, to say what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And the administration should simply follow this and implement our policies. Civil society should also follow up on what we do and try to help us in implementing these services, but not being a counter voice. So the underlying perspective of democracy, of that idea of it's the majority and they have a right to decide. And also we should be able to act fast and decisively. If we need to follow all the procedures, if we need to listen to civil society, if we need to listen to public services, we are slowed down. Thank you. So what happens if that idea of primaat van de politiek, primacy of politics, is growing and gaining more importance? On the one hand, vis-à-vis civil society. So, for example, in authoritarian systems, you see that government often has a very difficult relationship with civil society organizations. Sometimes they simply replace them by state actors, so taking over roles and tasks of civil society, putting them into government agencies. They may suppress civil society, try to control them, ignore them sometimes if they and try to push them away, or even allow them as long as they do things that are in accordance with government, with what the state at that moment wants. That's what we see in authoritarianism, but here what we want to say, importantly, also in what are still liberal democracies, there are some signs of civil service being under pressure. What are examples of them? I'm taking examples mainly from our context, again, the Flemish, the Belgian situation, not specifically because we're worse than other countries, but basically to show that also in what is still a democracy, things are sometimes being put under pressure in nowadays. Ignoring, for example, the dialogue, the social dialogue, where we have a long tradition. Also in healthcare, we have a long tradition of dialogue, and we see more and more that even, for example, recently about the index, even if social partners do get to an agreement, that government doesn't really listen to that, doesn't take up these elements, but wants to do its own without listening to advisory groups. Downplaying democratic legitimacy. There's examples of opinion pieces of ministers in medias trying to delegitimize civil society organizations. And for some parts, they might be right. For example, the attack on civil society organizations that not always being very representative of the broader population. Yes, that can be true. It's not necessarily so that every single civil society organization needs to be representative of the whole population either, because they can represent specific groups in society. But there are some, an example for students is youth movements. We know that youth movements often still are lacking in attracting young people from minority groups, and that they don't, that they're not that representative of the broader population. Cutting back finances, very much also towards civil society organizations that are rather critical towards government. We've seen a lot of that in the media of how our finances subsidies, and we have civil society that performs, as I said, public services also often for in difficult fields for different groups. So it is a sector that needs a lot of money to perform its work, and through that also depends on public financing. Regulatory overload, inspections, accountability measures that are increasing, and of course, again, accountability is good, but what is the reason behind changing some policies? Turning against protests, we see also in other countries in Europe more severe regulations towards public demonstrations, for example. The idea here that one wants to implement that if you're a civil society organization that, for example, engages in legal or administrative proceedings against policies, can you do that when you're subsidized by public money? But of course, we just saw that one of the basic elements of basic roles of a civil society is call for social change, is advocacy for interest. So you're sort of silencing them in their basic role. And then a last example, the creation of the attempts to create a legal framework for an administrative ban on radical organizations. Yes, there can be a debate on radical organizations and should we allow them, but it's quite obvious that this is dangerous if we give this power to government. It might not be dangerous in the current situation, but what if we have extremist parties in a government that can decide themselves what is a radical organization and what not, and which organization should be allowed or should be banned in our society? So again, these are all examples that we see in different countries, but that we should be aware that we see here as well. And yeah, in that sense, apologies for this being Dutch language, but it's all taken from our own media as examples of what I just provided. So civil society under pressure. Is the civil service administration also to a certain extent under pressure? Yes, and again we see that, and again in other countries it might be more severe than here, but also here we see signs of that. And one element therein is diminishing the capacity of public administration to take up its role by delegitimizing. Bureaucracy bashing in the US, it's the whole debate about the deep state, but also here there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of framing about the inefficiency of government, the questions about how neutral administrators are, etc. So in a way, you can also see that bureaucratic bashing as a step towards and also legitimizing more cutback, financial cutback of our governments. So on the one hand, there's how much pressure is there put on the capacity of the public service. On the other hand, how much pressure is there in transforming that public service and from what I just explained, that it is also as an instrument to make sure that policies are implemented in a correct way, which also means according to rule of law, according to procedures that defend that rule of law. And what are examples of things happening there? Trying to control by centralizing agencies, by challenging the civil service statute and sort of taking away protections of administrators to a sense. Diminishing external accountability, interaction with society, closing off government administrators from society, appointing loyalists, changing political administrative relations. We have a long debate about political appointments. It's not necessarily so that a political appointment is bad by definition. We have a tradition of also balancing different political powers in sort of in a frequency, being able to appoint people, certainly at the top of administrators. I do think we need to take into account it's not because somebody has a political affiliation that he or she is not competent. As if we work in a system that competency is linked to some political background, that can function because politicians also need some partners within the administration that they can trust in a way. But what is important is that idea, again, of speaking truth to power, of loyal contradiction. So enabling people to say, like, okay, this is, as politicians follow a certain idea, a certain ideology, but we need to be able to show them what, if you want to implement that policy, make that happen, what can be done, what cannot be done, what is the way to go forward. So that is an important one. So showing these elements, this is actually something that de Orde van de Vlaamse Balies, I'm trying to translate it, the Flemish Order of the Bars, so the advocacy, did an exercise 2 years ago when we were going into elections. And this is something, from my view, I'm sort of surprised that this didn't get much traction. They looked at the electoral programs of the different political parties and looked at like how many of the points put forward in these programs are actually real threats to democracy or potential threats to democracy. And of course, it's a very broad range. Some elements like, for example, doing away with compulsory voting was also seen as a potential threat to our democracy, so you can debate about that. But seeing that maybe it's not that surprising that an extremist party puts forward a program that's really a threat to our democracy, but also that many, that the parties that we see as the middle ground also have actually an electoral program where they want to convince people with a number of elements that you would say hopefully they don't actually implement this because these are threatening to this way of how we see democracy and how it, again, has been explained just now also by Stefan. So to conclude, this is my last slide. Democratic backsliding. Is that the case here and in other countries? Should we be worrying? Maybe on the one hand, yes. I think I showed a number of examples that really show that some of the crucial stakeholders in upholding democracy, civil society and civil service, as 2 examples there, are put under pressure, and we need to make sure that they can continue to play their role. They're not the only ones, and there's examples that you can easily find of other stakeholders, like the media, like the this area, like university. And of course, each of these we can debate. We can debate how neutral is university. On the other hand, if I hear a minister say about a report that contradicts her policy plans, it's just an opinion and I'm from another opinion, then I do have some worries, maybe as an academic, about how our research is evaluated and how evidence-based our policies are. So yes, there's a number of elements that I think we should be more aware of in society of what is happening. On the other hand, we are a democracy, we still are a democracy, and there's also a number of institutional buffers like the proportional electoral system, the checks and balances we do have in place, the multi-level governance, the fact that we're a very complex system with different layers of governments also makes sure and sort of assures that it's not so easily overtaken. So we shouldn't totally worry, but I would call out for some awareness of what is democracy and what is the role of different actors indeed in that democracy. Thank you.
Good evening. Let me start by asking you to imagine something. Imagine that the Belgian government passes a policy, something that you really like. Could be a policy about migration, climate, taxes, something that really benefits you. You've discussed this, something you're really happy about. So it's passed, you're super happy. And then it turns out that the process leading up to this decision, it wasn't entirely fair. So there are some things that didn't go well. What do you do? This is a question that I've studied together with Hannah Werner from the University of Zurich and Heribert Zhu from the University of St. Gallen in the past year. And what I want to do in this talk is I want to explain to you why this is such a key question, also with the topic of today. And I'll give you some empirical insights into how people react in a situation such as that. And one thing that I would really like you to take home with you is we talk a lot about citizens' trust and the lack of citizens' trust in politics and in government. We have a crisis of trust. This is widely debated. And I think we should be equally concerned about too much trust. And I'll explain why I think this is the case. So as Stefan already argued, defending democracy is a collective duty. And my colleague Trui Steen just talked about civil society and civil service, and I will focus on citizens. And the question that I want to address is, what is citizens' role in protecting the stability of democracy, and can they be safeguards for democracy? When we think about this question, political scientists, a very important critical concept for us in the survival of any political system and democracies in particular is perceptions of legitimacy. What are perceptions of legitimacy? These are the beliefs that a political process, an authority, a system, that is proper and just, and as a result, its decisions should be accepted. If this is not the case, then people don't accept an election outcome, a specific policy. We know from empirical research that they're less willing to pay their taxes, that they protest more, also violently. So perceptions of legitimacy are really important for a political system and for a democracy. And then as empirical scientists, we often measure that by perceptions of fairness or the willingness or to accept a decision or to appeal to a decision. And what we know is what has been established over and over again is that political decisions can be a policy, can be an election. They often generate winners and losers, and they have different levels of legitimacy. Generally, here you see 2 points in time, a political decision in between. let me see whether I can, yes. So 2 points in time, political decision in between, and then you have the level of perceived legitimacy, and winners generally have higher levels of perceived legitimacy than losers. And as political scientists, we've often focused on these election losers or these policy losers because these are really important for democracy. In a democracy, it's really important that election losers, that policy losers, that they accept their defeat. And this is what we call losers' consent in the literature. So we focused a lot on that with the idea of we need to get losers' consent up. You didn't get what you want, but you accept the result because the process was fair. However, this concept rests on a very big assumption, two big assumptions actually. One about the political decision-making, that this process leading up to this decision that was fair, that was up to standard, and that higher levels of perceived legitimacy are better. And this is what we've already discussed tonight. We've often taken that for granted in established democracies, that these processes are fair, that they were democratic, and that we should accept the decisions coming from that process. What you're seeing here is recent data from the VDEM that tracks a wide variety of indicators of the quality of democracy. In red, you see countries moving towards autocracy. In blue, you see countries that in the past year moved towards democracy. And as you can see, the map is turning rather red than blue, so we are going towards autocracies. And also, and that has also been a point that my colleagues have made today, also in established democracies, we're seeing lots of moves towards autocratization, lots of violations of democratic procedures, procedures that are not fair, that are not democratic, that are not up for granted. So the point that I want to make is, in that case, rather than losers having to accept their defeat, if we think about this collective duty that we have, rather than accepting, we should not focus on losers accepting, but we should actually also focus on winners that lower their perception of legitimacy if a process was not up to standard, if a process was flawed. This is what I call, together with colleagues, winners restraint. So we think it is really important that there is a withdrawal of perceived legitimacy by electoral or policy winners from elites in power when those elites violate rules or democratic principles. So this basically means that if you get an outcome that really benefits you, that you can say, okay, this benefits me, but the way I got it was not okay. So it means putting democratic principles above your own short-term gains. And this really matters because a lot of the threats that we're seeing to democracy actually comes from within. It doesn't come from coups or revolutions. It comes from leaders who are elected democratically and from citizens that tolerate democratic violations, from perceptions of legitimacy that are too high. So citizens' collective duty is accepting losses when the process was fair, but also, if the process wasn't fair, to withdraw their support. What do people do? Do people practice constraint? Do they perceive flawed processes as flawed? Do they agree that certain processes need to be appealed? Let me show you some empirical results from public opinion insights. So these are the results that I will show are from a survey conducted in the context of the Brexit negotiations of about 1,000 people in the UK, and they show the proportion of respondents that considered certain behaviors as unacceptable. And the first one, this is about a campaign breaching electoral law. So there we clearly state that this is illegal behavior. A law has been breached, and there you see that respondents, whether they voted to remain or leave, that they agree about 80–90% says this is unacceptable. Breaching the law is unacceptable behavior. If we don't explicitly state that, but if you say, for instance, governments disregarding a court ruling, we give a specific example for that, or government disregarding parliament disregarding a referendum, then we see quite some difference between those two groups. So you have the red is the people that voted leave in the referendum, the blue is the people that voted remain, and as you can see, the dots are quite far apart. So these groups have different opinions on whether these violations are acceptable or unacceptable. And the general pattern, what you see here, it's here. These are the people that find these processes rather acceptable. You see both red and blue dots, and the difference is when people benefit, they're much more likely to accept a flawed process. So government disregarding a court ruling, this was more in favor of the leave camp, so they thought it was way more acceptable. While disregarding parliament, the leave camp thought this was way more unacceptable than the remain camp. And this is a pattern that is very much in line with a lot of evidence that we find in political science, is when people benefit, they're way more likely to accept a flawed process. Which makes political scientists rather pessimistic. And this is summed up in a slogan that you often see in literature, partisans first, Democrats second. While in general we find high support for democracy, if you then take these specific cases, then you see that people often behave as partisans first and Democrats second. However, looking at all this evidence, we were wondering maybe there is a tipping point. Maybe if violations maybe there is some kind of tipping point where people are like, okay, this is unacceptable, yes, this is an unfair process. Because we know, for instance, from fact-checking research, if the evidence builds that at a certain point in the beginning people can look away and could counter reason, but at a certain point the evidence is so strong they do update their opinions. So maybe also here, when violations accumulate, maybe there is a tipping point that people become more Democrats than partisans. And this is actually also how democratic erosion often works. It's with incremental steps. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's small steps that this democratic erosion often occurs. So maybe this winner constraint can be activated when procedural violations accumulate. A lot of these violations my colleagues already talked about. I've also have some examples with me from Flanders. There are examples of illegal acts that we can find here, but I want to also take a broader look. It's not just about illegal violations, it's also, for instance, about a minister that has a conflict, a potential conflict of interest that she wasn't transparent about. It's, for instance, a minister that made laws and then right after becoming a minister works for a lobby organization. These things aren't illegal. But there are some potential conflicts of interest there. It's about transparency of the allocation of public money. It's about independence of the media. So these are the things that you can have in mind when thinking about these violations. And what I'll present to you is I'll present some experimental evidence where two things were manipulated. content of the decision, whether we asked people what their policy preference was, and then they got a policy that they wanted or that they don't want it, so we made them into a winner or a loser, and the process itself. And what you see here is whether their evaluation, whether the process was unfair, whether the decision should be appealed. And here you see the scale. The higher, the more unfair the process. We have a process with no flaws, 1 flaw, 2 flaws, 3 flaws, 4 flaws. And first of all, if we compare the same flawed process, so there were 4 different flaws, so there were conflicts of interest, there was the silence, the limiting of the public debate, the opposition voices that were silenced. So there were 4 flaws that people got information about, and this group didn't get the outcome that they preferred, and this group got the outcome that they preferred. And as you could expect from what I said earlier, people that don't like the outcome, they think the process is more unfair. So you find this winner-loser gap here. Winners tolerate unfairness more. And when people win, they're much more likely to accept flawed processes compared to when they lose. So they see the exact same violations. So this was an experiment. You see the exact same violations, but you evaluate them differently depending on whether you like the outcome or not. So winning makes us more forgiving. However, also some good news here. People still care about fairness. They also still care about how decisions are made. If we compare both winners, so they both like the outcome. Here there are no flaws. They didn't get any information on flaws in the process. And here they got information on 1 flaw. Then you see quite a big difference in how unfair they judge the process or whether they think the decision should be appealed. So winners do react to flaws. And what you see here, if we go from no flaw to 1, 2, 3, 4, you see this builds up. So people think the process becomes more and more unfair. So even if they like the outcome, they do react to this process information. So we take from that this restraint can be activated, that policy losers react more strongly to flawed processes than policy winners, but policy winners do react to that. So that's a bit of hope in this pessimistic conclusion that people do react. And actually, if you look at the numbers, that's also interesting. Here, these 4 flaws, that's the majority of people. So in that sense, if you want to be a glass half full person, we could activate this restraint, and more than the majority of people said at a certain point, this process is flawed, it should be appealed. However, also a sizable minority, about a third, still thought after seeing all of these violations that this process was fair. So we see this initial shock already from the first flaw, people react, and then you see restraint building up over time. So what do we take from these findings? So constraint can be activated. So if you sometimes lose energy and think what's the point of it, constraint can be activated. So people, even if they really like the outcome, if the process is flawed, they can also see it as such. How can we activate it? 3 important things that very much connect to what has already been said. So I really want to reiterate the importance of civic education. People need to understand democratic principles, and crucially, they need to understand when they are violated. Because in real life, violations are sometimes subtle, they're debated, they're not always illegal. So civic education can help people recognize when their side crosses the line. And what is also really important, if we look at public opinion research, this very much connects to the point that Stefan Rummens was making in the beginning. People's idea of what democracy is rather narrow and very much connected to this first point. If you ask people what is democracy, they think about elections, majorities, responsiveness. The rule of law, protection of minorities, they think about that today way less. So in that sense, civic education is really important because democracy is indeed more than majorities. And this narrow idea of what a democracy is indeed very dangerous for populist leaders to portray media courts and civil society as obstacles rather than safeguards to democracy. So it's really important to defend this broader, richer concept of democracy. So civic education to know what democratic principles are and when they are violated. Secondly, also really important, violations only matter if people see them. So it's really important that people know when democratic principles are violated. If violations are not visible, then we cannot protest. So media independence, platform regulation as well, because today what people see is often shaped by digital platforms that often amplify partisan content. And lastly, you are all citizens. You all have a duty. Democracy depends on people that are willing to lose. For instance, if Trump says, I accept the outcome if I win, or Wilders questions the outcome of the election without clear evidence, that is bad. Losing, that is problematic in a democracy. But equally so, it's also important that there are good winners and that you withdraw your support if a process is flawed, even if the outcome serves you. It's very easy to protest a process when you don't like the outcome or when the outcome serves you. It's harder, but I think it's really important that we do so. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm a little bit the odd one out here. I'm a simple psychologist. I'm not a political psychologist. I'm not even a social psychologist. I'm an experimental psychologist. So I live in the laboratory. And my focus of my study is anxiety. So I know a thing or two about anxiety. And tonight I want to see what the mechanism of anxiety can teach us about the appeal of autocracy within the context of a democracy. Okay. Let me first start by saying that we live in the most hopeful time ever. And the reason that I state this here is that I think most people here believe the opposite, like these are anxious times, uncertain times, and that's very true. But that we should not forget that for some people, these are really the most hopeful times ever. Some people are relieved that finally someone is stepping up and protecting our rights. People who vote for Trump, for example, after all those years where they were never heard, these are finally the hopeful times. So when we characterize these times as anxious, uncertain times, it doesn't include everyone. And I think Professor Rummens already noted this, like there's always more than one voice in society. So I think that's very important always to keep in mind. And the second one is, are we blinded by emotions? I see in newspapers a lot of times that we tend to explain voters' behavior based on their emotions. Like a Trump voter is angry, outraged, or anxious. And this may be very well the case, but the connotation is very important. By explaining behavior based on emotion, implicitly you're saying something like it's a kind of an impulsive, irrational act, like a child maybe, just following the emotions. And I want to counter this here by saying that emotions are actually rational expressions of what we find important. If you think about it, when do we feel emotional? It's when we think about something that matters to us, something that we find important, maybe something that is at stake. So when we're afraid, something important is at stake. When we're angry, it's at stake. When we're sad, something important is at stake. And so psychological research has shown that when we feel emotions, our thinking is still straight. I mean, emotions are a way of thinking. You think about things that matter to you. And I'll show you later on that, of course, we make mistakes in our reasoning. We do that when we feel emotions, but we also do that when we don't feel emotions. It's just that we see those mistakes more when we feel emotions, because that's the moment where we think about things that matter to us. And so I think for the political debate, we should stop explaining other people's behavior, voting behavior, as fueled by irrational emotions. Because by doing that, we push them out of the discussion platform, out of the rational discussion platform. We should keep everybody in so that we can discuss with each other. So rather than talking about emotions, we should look for what are the goals and the values behind those emotions. Because when you feel an emotion, it means that something of value is important to you. So in a rational discussion, you try to grasp what is important, what is of goal, the value of the other person, rather than just explaining it through some kind of irrational emotion. So no, we're not blinded by emotion. We can think clearly when we feel emotions. It just shows what is important to us. What emotions do, however, is that they lead our attention to these things that are at stake and when they're most urgent and pressing. Right? Our emotions direct our thinking, our feeling, our acting towards things that are most important to us. Luckily, they do so, right? Otherwise, everything would be equally important in our lives, and we would not be able to make any decision, right? Our emotions tell us what we find important, and they focus our attention to it. And I can explain this very well in anxiety. So this is research based on animals and human animals as well in the laboratory, where we see that the closer you come to a certain expected danger, the more focused you are at that danger, of course. When you face a specific danger, you better take it into account, you better focus your attention to it. And so you can see we go from safe to danger here. And that continuum creates different emotional states that direct our attention and our thinking. And we call them technically, first state is anxiety. When you're anxious, it means that there's something it's not quite right. Onbehagen in Dutch. You know something could be wrong, but there's no clear signal of danger. When you're in a state of fear, it means that the danger is right in front of you. You focus your attention. You should be taking this seriously. When you're in a state of panic, it means that the danger jumped on you, it's on your skin, you have to fight for your life. Those are three dissociable emotional states that we can also dissociate in the brain, actually. So the anxious state is linked to the beta nucleus of the stria terminalis, the fear state to the amygdala, and the panic state to the periaqueductal gray. Now, this is interesting for people who like the brain, but for society, behavior is more important, of course. And what we see is that behavioral flexibility, or the freedom that you have to decide what you will do, is much bigger on the safe side, and it narrows down towards the closest location to the danger. So when you're in a safe spot, you have the freedom to try out many things, trial and error learning. You can make mistakes and go on. If you're looking for food, if you don't find food in one location, you just go to the other one. If you're out dating, for example, it doesn't go well one night, you learn from your mistake and you go to the next night, right? It doesn't really matter. You can learn from your mistakes. But if you're in a phase of danger, you only have one shot. It's a life or death situation. So the closer you come to a perceived threat, the less flexibility there is in your behavior. It narrows down, luckily, right? Because we need to respond to that danger. So that's how our brain, through evolution, has been shaped to direct our attention more and more towards things that are really important to us. Yeah? To make sure that when you're in a very dangerous place, you're not thinking about what you will eat for dinner tonight. Okay. If I link this now to the discussion of today, I would say that the democratic appeal is strongest on that safe side, when there is time to make mistakes, when you can try out things, where you can discuss things before you act, right? And that the autocratic appeal becomes stronger the closer you get to a perceived threat. So that's why being anxious, being in an anxious state might make us more prone to autocratic values. And so this is my reasoning based on what I know from the laboratory, the fundamental mechanism of anxiety. But I was very happy to read in a recent paper by Alsbra and colleagues something very similar. And this is based on big survey research, where they said that right-wing authoritarianism originates from the belief that the social world is an inherently dangerous, unstable, unpredictable, and threatening place. And so this is done by questionnaires where you can measure how authoritarian people's values are, and you can also measure how they look at the world, and there's a big correlation between those two. So indeed, anxiety seems to be a very important breeding ground. And coupled with social conformity, so how important you feel it is to conform to a group, leads to the motivational goal of ensuring collective security and stability through the coercive maintenance of the traditional order. So that's autocratic, authoritarianistic influences. And so this is what interests me, like how do people arrive at that belief that the world is a dangerous place? And you can see that for some people in our society, this is actually a reality. So if you live in poverty, for example, if you live in a lower social class, the world is actually a dangerous place for you. You have to survive day by day. You're faced with many, many threats. And so for people in that situation, there is actually reason to view the world in this way. But what we've seen over the last decades is that average people in the Western countries have become more and more pessimistic about their country, about the world, about the future of the world. Even people from the middle class. And so that made me wonder, like, why do so many people from the middle class, and almost anybody I talk to, is pessimistic in our society, despite all the great things that we have also achieved. And I wrote that in a book, my ideas about this a couple of years ago, and also a book by Daniel Gardner, a journalist who wrote a great book, The Science of Fear. So really investigating like what drives this pessimistic and threatening worldview. And I think there's like a triad of things here working. It's the media, marketing, and psychology. And so I think these things lead up to pessimism and is a breeding ground for appeal to autocratic regimes. So for the media, we all know how the media work, and social media works the same way. It's sensational, of course. We only read things that are sensational, that capture our attention. It's always negative news. Nobody watches positive news. I know that in La Nice, for example, they have this rule that they publish every day 10% of their articles is positive, but almost nobody clicks on it. But they keep doing it because they believe that they should put out something positive, but people don't look at it. We've evolved to look at potentially dangerous information because it might be useful for us to survive. That's a basic explanation. In the news cycle, we only hear about new and surprising things. In the word news is the word new. So the news only report about new things, things that we didn't know yet, only about new dangers. All dangers we never talk about. Diarrhea, for example. Millions of people die every year from diarrhea, but yeah, that's old news, we don't hear about it. Only surprising new things. Which gives the impression that we're surrounded by always new dangers, always new threats. And it also focuses on absolute risk. If a certain behavior increases your risk of a certain cancer with 30%, it sounds really threatening. But if the base rate is 0.1%, an increase with 30% is much less threatening to you. So the news never looks at the relative risk, but always the absolute risk. And so this serves as a magnifying glass of our own bias towards negative information and really fuels it, right? and in my opinion, increases that pessimistic state. And it fuels also the rumor mill. We also talk to each other about the negative things that we read in the news or saw in the news. We don't talk so much about the positive things. So it's not the blame of the media, it's basically how we all function. Okay, next to media, there's also marketing, and it's sometimes called the fear industry. In our society, it's very important to appeal to people, to grab people's attention for a certain cause that you believe in. And the best way to do that is to put out emotional campaigns to either trigger the desire of people or trigger the fear of people. Right? And so, for example, politicians, of course, do this, right? Try to grab attention by warning for certain dangers. Government agencies do it as well. Companies do it. If you want to sell a drug, for example, you better make people a little bit anxious about certain diseases. That's just one example. Activists do it, Greenpeace or other organizations. If they want people to be motivated for their cause, they need to be sure that they convey their message in an emotionally powerful way, and that's often with fear. As researchers, when I apply for a research grant on anxiety disorders, for example, I will not say how great we are at this moment already in treating anxiety, which we are actually, but I will emphasize what we cannot do yet, the pressing problem, the urgent problem. So I also, it's not eliciting fear necessarily, but it's also focusing on the things that are going wrong today. And so that's perfectly legitimate, all of this, but the end of this game is, of course, that we're all surrounded by people screaming that there's something to be feared, something to be threatened, that is threatening you. And so a citizen finds him or herself in a context of increasing fears. And the last one is our own psychology. So we have two systems of thinking. The one is called, you can call the gut system, intuition, feeling-based, quick thinking, easy thinking. So we can quickly form opinions about things, or just an estimation of a risk, for example. We usually do it by gut feeling. Very rarely we stop and really try to statistical reason, like what would be the real chance of this or that happening. It's cumbersome, it's slow, it's difficult. We never do it. And I could give you examples with some questions, and most of us would fail in very easy questions because we like to follow our gut feeling. Okay? And so altogether, oops. Oh yeah, of course, Jaws. So I wanted to show you this because this movie came out at the end of the 70s, I think. Because of this movie, millions of people became afraid of going into the water. Although you know rationally that there's no sharks there, and even if there are sharks, probably not dangerous, it doesn't feel that way. A lot of people had the feeling something is not quite right, because when they were walking on the beach, these images pop into the mind and creating some kind of risk estimation. That's the gut feeling, right? It oftentimes takes over. Also metaphors. I'm probably maybe the only one in this room who is afraid of metaphors. But I know how metaphors can influence our thinking. And this was very nicely shown by psychology researchers in the United States, where they had an auditorium like this filled with people, and a second one as well. So there's two groups of participants, and they all received the same text about a certain fictitious city of Addison, and they received a text about criminality statistics. And these crime statistics were rising over the years, and so they got some numbers and whatnot. And then they had to answer some questions about what is the cause of these crime statistics and what would you do against it, how would you solve it. And the only very small difference between the two groups of people was the very first sentence in that text. One group received the sentence, "Crime is a beast ravaging the city of Addison." That's the one group. The other group received the sentence, "Crime is a virus ravaging the city of Addison." And this very small sentence, this metaphor, had a big influence on what people thought were the consequences of the crime and how to solve it. So the ones who saw the metaphor of the beast would say, you have to find the criminal, lock him or her up, and put them away out of the city. The people who read that it was a virus, they were more, they would propose more to go into the city to find out in the social context what drives the increase of the crimes and try to solve it within the social context. As you can see, these are more right-wing and left-wing solutions. And this little sentence had more influence than people's political orientation, right or left-wing. So metaphors, if you see one, watch out, because people take over how you think about things. And we can see this in everyday newspaper, like a stream of refugees, vluchtelingenstroom, for example, migrants. So you can see the river flowing in, people are, and the only way that you can stop it is to block it, right? The water has to flow outside of us. So by using this metaphor, you're kind of installing already ideas about how to deal with this. Our economy is sick. It's like a patient laying in a bed, cannot do anything, and is just hoping that the doctor will save it, and that probably there has to be some medication, or that the patient will have to take medication with some side effects, which may be painful, but we need to do it to get it right. So with this sickness metaphor, you already install a lot of ideas about how to solve this trade war. It's not a war, right? Everybody knows it, and yet we use the word trade wars. Sleepwalking, the EU has been sleepwalking into this war with Russia, Ukraine and Russia, and we haven't spent enough budget. We were sleepwalking. Those are metaphors that create some helplessness about ourselves. So beware of metaphors. They also increase our perception of threat. And so all these things together, I think, fuel pessimism, fear, that dangerous worldview, hopelessness, helplessness. And as we saw before, this is probably a breeding ground for a bigger appeal to autocratic regimes. I think what is driving this actually is that if this is our society, and this is the ideal, we all have our ideals about what would be the best society that we could live in and what we should do to get there. We all look ahead to forward toward our ideals, and this can be very frustrating. You're looking at something that's shining ahead of you, but we're not there. And so everybody is criticizing the society because, of course, it has flaws. But we not so often look backward, like where did we come from? How did we get here? What have we improved over time? So I think if you only focus on what we cannot do, where we're not yet, that ultimately leads to some pessimism. But if you look backwards, we can find some optimism there. What I want to talk about here is the paradox of internal critique. This is just my own opinion, but I think it also relates to something that Professor Rummens has said before, is that critique is very important in a democracy, the freedom of speech, and the only way by which we can go forward is to criticize every little thing that we do. Critique is the most important engine of progress. But at the same time, for each an individual citizen, everything is being criticized. And so in the end, it seems like nothing is going forward. So despite the fact that critique leads to progress, it leads to diminished perception of progress. And I think that's why maybe democracy has the seeds in itself towards autocracy, because the critique, the freedom of speech, may fuel this breeding ground of pessimism that can increase the appeal of autocracy. If I look back, things that make me optimistic is, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is arguably the most important document ever created by mankind. I always had the impression that this was an exceptional time after the World War II, when everybody was hugging each other and, oh, we're past the war, and yeah, this is very important. We should love each other, you know, and this should be great. If you look back at history, this was not the case. 1945 until 1948, with a lot of tension in the world. There was a war between India and Pakistan. There was a civil war in China. Stalin had already blocked Berlin. I mean, if you compare it to today, I guess it's more or less comparable, the state of the tension and uncertainty in the world. And yet we were able to get together and create a universal declaration. So it tells me that even in difficult times, dark times, we're still able to do very great things. And the other thing that makes me optimistic is this man. I don't know if anybody recognizes this man. It's Norman Borlaug. I had never heard of this man until recently. It's a biologist. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, which is already remarkable, a biologist winning the Peace Prize. It was for the Green Revolution, so he discovered ways by which farmers worldwide could increase crop yields by 3 times, and he saved more or less 1 billion lives. 1 billion lives. And nobody of us knows about him. There's no street name to him. And that's something that really struck me, that the heroes of progress, we don't know them. We know everything that goes wrong, everything that's been criticized, but not about what is great, or much less at least. And I think the culture of democracy maybe needs heroes and rally around the flag, pledge allegiance to democratic values maybe, to really make sure like people can cherish our society a little bit more, while at the same time criticizing it and going forward. And I'm almost at the end, I guess, yeah. So when we go from fear to hope, the formula of fear that we use is a function of the likelihood of the danger that we expect, the impact that it would have if the danger would really arrive, and then the amount of control that we have over that danger. And you see, 1 minus controllability. So the less controllability you have, the more fearful you will be. And so that control and sense of agency of things that occurring to us is very important for stability and security and decreasing pessimism. And as a psychologist, when we investigate this in a personal context, it's very clear. When you think something bad is going to happen, you can act against it. But of course, when your society is under threat, as a person, you cannot do anything. The only thing that you can do there is to trust the institutions, indeed. So, and the third, what was it, at Middenveld? The third sector, yes, exactly. And so trust breeds hope. And so I think for people to be less pessimistic, less fearful, we need to find ways that we can trust our institutions, the way that things work. And hooray, another case of corruption. Whenever we read in the news a case of corruption, we should be cheerful, because it tells us that we live in a country where this is deemed exceptional, and where we have institutions that can actually discover this. Whereas if you would live in a country where corruption is everywhere, then it would not be exceptional, it would not reach the news, and it would probably not even be discovered. And so, of course, that's the paradox. We hate corruption for good reason, and yet at the same time, the fact that we know about it tells us that certain institutions are working well. And so I think that's the most important thing. And I would like to end with Nick Cave with the phrase, hope is optimism with a broken heart. We know that nothing is perfect, that we live in uncertain times, but hope is optimism nevertheless. Thank you so much.
We've received many questions. I'll have to be selective, and I'll also make sure that there's a collective panel discussion. So maybe I can start with a few specific questions for some people. So there was a question for Bram Vervliet at the very end, asking, how can you explain the acceptance of autocracy in a situation where people are very pleased and not anxious, like in China? So autocracy accepted in China, it seems, in your view, autocracy is possible when people are very afraid. I have maybe a similar question, if I may, and I'll give you the floor in a second, for Sofie, Marien. The analysis was that winners should show more restraint when the process was unfair. But can you say something on how to determine whether the process was unfair? I can imagine that some Trump voters might want to say that the Biden election was unfair. They should show more winners restraint. So is it important to talk about how to define when winners restraint must be activated, or how to define what the process is? Maybe I can start with a question for Bram.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I was talking about the seeds of autocracy within the context of a democracy. So how does a democracy, why is it that autocracy can be appealing to people who live in a democracy? And I think there the anxiety and the pessimism is a breeding ground. Yeah. But of course, if you grow up, if you live in a country with that regime, it might be different.
Thank you. Can I, on that, ask you, sometimes when I heard you talk, I had to think of a sort of happy, calm, reasoned, democratic person who maybe is a bit boring, who maybe is never really motivated to argue in favor of particular political positions because everything is fine, the status quo is nice. I'm reminded of sort of the depoliticization at the end of the 90s, lower voter turnout. Don't you need passion to make democracy work as well?
I very much think so. And I think that's why I talked about the paradox of critique. Yeah. We need critique. Democracy is critique. It's conflict, or organized conflict. We need that passion indeed as well. So many people want to change the world for the better because they have a certain cause, they're passionate about their things. So it is the basis, but there's a downside of that constant critique as well, fueling pessimism potentially.
Yeah, thank you. Can we maybe go to you, Sofie? Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Indeed, the whole concept of what is democratic, what is not, what is fair, what is not, that is part of the public debate. And I think in the first talk, Stefan Rummens also talked about that, a populist being democratic or not. So that is part of the debate. And I think what is a democracy? I think Stefan did an excellent job in explaining what the important democratic principles are, and that it's more than majority will, that it's also rules of law. And I think what I find very important is that it's not only when laws are broken that we should protest, but it goes further than that. It's about democratic principles. And of course, sometimes we can have a discussion. I think the discussion is also important. For instance, should a referendum be followed or not? These are things that we can debate about. But I think, yeah, the framework that Stefan presented, I think that's an excellent job about what democracy is.
Somebody else in the audience asked a question somewhat related to this. The question is, should we not simply put more importance in the system itself, the voting process, constitution, the judicial power? So the argument is, if they win, if a position wins, then we just need to trust the system, and that will strengthen the established power. Is that not simply what needs to be done? Perhaps it's part of what you said at the end.
I'm going to refer back to Stefan in the sense that I completely agree with what you presented, that institutions are part of it, but institutions in and of itself, you cannot regulate everything or have like the perfect institutions that in every way. We really also need this democratic culture. We need people to defend, speak up, and also in Belgium. That's why I showed the Belgium examples. I think there are plenty of moments that we need to speak up for democracy. So yes, institutions for sure. And in my talk, because we only had 20 minutes, I focused on this political culture part of it. And obviously, institutions are super important, but institutions in and of itself, that's not enough.
I think we have naturally transitioned to the two other speakers. Maybe I can start with a question for Stefan Rummens. A question for Stefan would be, some of the solutions or suggestions you made at the end seemed to have the effect of constraining the liberal aspect of democracy more, or making sure that democracies don't become too ideological and liberal? Think about the activistic courts that you worried about. Some of your suggestions, however, in your last slide, I think, or your one bus last slide, went into the other direction to make sure that we sometimes also constrain the democratic aspect of democracy. For example, when you talked about the cordon sanitaire, that's interesting because these suggestions seem to go in a different road. Is there like a rule to decide when we should become more liberal or stress the liberal aspect more or less, and when the other side needs to be strengthened more? Is there something to be said about that? While Stefan is preparing the answer, there is a question for Trui in the same respect maybe. So the question for Trui Steen might be, can civil servants sometimes be too activistic or too liberal and therefore also be a danger for democracy or liberal democracy? The question is raised because the threats you identified there seem to all be about governments restraining or the power of civil servants, maybe instrumentalizing them, seeing them purely as effective people to carry out what was already decided top down. But is there the other danger as well, or is that not a danger we should worry about? This is the question maybe.
So yes, it's an interesting question, and so I'm glad with the question because I think that then it means that it came across what I wanted to convey. So one of the central theses of Habermas as this important democratic theorist is that the liberal and the democratic dimension of liberal democracy are co-original. So we need both at the same time. You really cannot have the one without the other. So it is indeed about finding the proper way of combining both. Are there clear-cut rules for saying this is too liberal, this is not liberal enough? No, there are no clear-cut rules. There is an important gray zone, but the fact that there is a gray zone does not mean that there are not some black and white cases. Yeah? So if you have a party that advocates for measures that are clearly going against the principle of equality, going against freedom of religion, like we have one in this country, then it is clear that we should intervene, that these are not acceptable propositions. At the same time, when we have important decisions to make, such as, for instance, how to deal with climate change, this is so very important that we have to connect this with the people at large. This needs to be a collective learning process. This needs to be a collective decision that we as a society make. And so this should not be something that is imposed top-down on us through a Green Deal in the European Union or through courts. Again, that does not mean that the European Commission or the courts have no role to play at all, but it means that the important decisions really also have to come bottom up, have to be part of this collective learning process. So no, it's not, there is an important gray zone, there are no clear-cut answers, but I think that is precisely what the concentric model also allows for. Yeah? Democracy, we have time and place to discuss things. That is what we do in civil society. That is why I think it's important that also extreme or unpleasant views are expressed. They are part of it. So we have a lot of leeway for dealing with the gray zone.
Thank you. Trui, would you like to speak to the question? Maybe I'll phrase it in the way it was asked. Why is the civil service, in your view, assumed to be always inherently correct in their opposition?
Okay. Yeah. Yes, no, I don't assume this, I think. Can civil service be too activist? Yes, but I think also that the answer is easier to provide in theory than in practice, because in theory you can say, okay, it is clear what the civil service needs to do is to make sure to control that rule of law is followed, that laws are followed. So if they see something happening by the executive, by politicians that breaches our constitutions, that breaches our law, they are to speak out towards that and say like this cannot happen. But as I say, I mean, and we see some of these things happening in practice. We've seen at a certain moment that administrators from Fedazil wrote a letter to the minister saying like, what is happening here is against all laws, also European laws about treatment of refugees, etc. This cannot be done. Or we saw in the Netherlands that at a certain moment there were administrators when Wilders was in power, administrators that literally went on the street saying like, we cannot execute these policies because they are breaching laws. So in theory, that sounds easy, but in practice, easy in a sense that certainly not, it's not about your personal, an administrator can have a personal opinion. It's a person, he or she will have his or her own ideological thoughts, but should be neutral. If we talk about speaking truth to power, if we talk about loyal contradiction, the word loyal, you should be loyal to the elected politician, but able to contradict if saying like, this is what procedures say we can or cannot do, this is what the law says we can or cannot do. So you shouldn't take your personal opinion, but that's where I say like theory is easier than practice, because you can also easily come up with examples of what if a certain person from, based on his or her religious background, has difficulties with certain policies like gay marriage. Or can you force people to implement these, or can you allow people to say like, based on your religion, we respect that you don't want to implement that personally, and that maybe other administrators are taking over now. Is this some, and that is something that is that's much more under debate about what can happen. I think so. Basically, no, shouldn't be activists. Should be protecting rules and laws. But where do these dividing lines, or can in reality be more, unclear also?
Thank you. I have a very quick follow-up. It's a specific small question, I think, but is there a way to ensure the power of civilians when civic space is shrinking? So when budget cuts in civil society are happening, when freedom of speech is being criminalized, what can concrete individual civilians do? Do you have a suggestion to that? You said some things, of course, but can you say something to that?
Well, in a way you can say, certainly when it comes to civil society is organized citizens. Mm-hmm. So it is us, civil society. It's civil society in partly is professionals, but also partly is volunteers. Civil society exists because it is supported by citizens. So you could say it's a bit double. It's one of its major roles that I pointed out is that idea of participation and making sure that building communities, getting people involved, engaged, but you could also turn that around. It's through us as citizens being involved, working and supporting and volunteering in civil society, that we make the strength of civil society as well, and that we legitimize civil society in a way also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one more question to Bram? I know this metaphor specialist, George Lakoff, and George Lakoff has argued that often Democrats in the US have a tendency to speak without metaphors and Republicans master metaphors. When you said what you said, I had to think of his message, because his message is that Democrats, or the Democratic Party, should use metaphors more, not leave emotions, so to speak, to the Republicans. You seemed to be saying what George Lakoff counsels against, or maybe I'm misunderstanding. Is that true? So would there be some value in telling Democrats or liberal Democrats try to capture emotions more instead of trying to speak in a reasoned way? Is there something to that?
Yes, of course. I think if you want to win the elections, that's a very good way to do it. And I think, George Lakoff also said that we use a metaphor in every sentence. If I tell you, do you see what I mean? I don't expect you to literally see what I mean, but it's a metaphor. Do you understand what I mean? So we use metaphors in every sentence almost. So it's very natural to use it, and it's a way, it's framing basically, right? To put attention to certain aspects. It's a powerful way. It can also be emotional. It can really trigger motivation in people. So it's not necessarily bad, of course, to use it, but as a reader or as a listener, it's very good to be aware of it.
Yeah. In order to tame the beast.
To tame the beast,
yes.
So to speak.
Okay, I have one more specific question for Stefan Rummens, and then, if that's okay, I would like to end with the Last question that came up multiple times. I'll already say the question and I'll give everyone the chance to maybe say something to it, which is simply the question, why do we want to have a democracy? Why should we go for a democracy? Is that a moral thing? Is it to respect other citizens, or is it purely to prevent war or not get to war? Why do we like this thing, democracy? Is the last question I'll ask to everyone. But a question, Stefan, that quite a few people raised with respect to your cordon sanitaire statement is one you surely will have expected. How can it be democratic if people cannot elect extremists, even if it will destroy democracy? If you exclude extremist actors from taking part in government, like the cordon sanitaire, is that not indemocratic or undemocratic in itself? I'm sure you've had this question before.
Yeah, sure. This is unavoidable. This is what we also call the paradox of tolerance. Yeah. So, should we tolerate people preaching intolerance? So, on the one hand, you're committed to tolerance, and you want to be tolerant toward these people. But if you are tolerant to these people, then they will abolish your tolerant society. So that doesn't help you. And so in that sense, yes, I'm a militant defender of democracy. This means, like I've emphasized, democracy is not a neutral regime. Yeah? Democracy is a very specific way of organizing society on the basis of the core values of liberty and equality. And if you want to defend that regime, sometimes you have to act against the enemies of that regime. And so in that sense, extremist actors coming up on the democratic stage should not be treated as ordinary democratic actors, because they are not. Yeah? They are enemies, they are a potential threat to the survival of the system as such, and this system, to the extent that you believe in its values, you should help to defend the system. And that is indeed what we are doing with the cordon sanitaire. So that is a legitimate positioning. No, democracy is not neutral. It is a value-laden regime that has its enemies, and if it wants to survive, it has to be able to protect itself and therefore treat these enemies of democracy differently than it treats other actors. That is not undemocratic, that is fully consistent with the core values of the regime that you want to defend.
Thank you. So I announced the final question. Maybe I'll read it in the words of some people. The question is, why do we want the system? Why should we stick to it? Why are you all in favor of the system, people sitting here? So people ask, why do we need to defend democracy? Is that a moral issue? Is it just the best way to keep us from waging war too easily? How exactly is it better than autocracy? Why must it be protected at all costs? Would you like to start and say something, and then I'll just, by the end of the row, we'll conclude the debate.
I'm really happy that you raised that question, because I think, in a series as tonight, that is something that we should make very explicit. For me, it's not about outcomes, it's not about efficiency, it's very much about this is the most fair system that there is. So it's a question of fairness for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is no final justification. We have learned in philosophy that you cannot ultimately justify a certain system or a set of moral values. So it's a position that you take. And in this case, it is about freedom and equality. If you live in an autocracy, you're no longer free to think what you want, to say what you want, to do what you want. So if you cherish freedom, if you cherish equality, there really is no alternative.
There is no alternative. Okay. If you choose this value. Yes.
I first wanted to say that democracy is ugly, but war is even more ugly. So that would be the first statement. But actually, I think that for people there are three important things: welfare, freedom, and security, safety, security. And I think that non-democratic regimes can fulfill one or two of those three things, but I think democracy is the only one who can kind of balance those three values against each other. I think those are the most important ones.
Yeah, what you say goes more in the direction of efficiency than what Stefan just said. I remember Amartya Sen saying that in a real democracy, there's never been a famine. So speaking to the welfare dimension or the efficiency that you stressed, but you also stressed the freedom, of course. Yes. Trui, would you like the final word?
Well, I think if you value something, there's two ways. You can value something because it's functional, and that's the whole idea of it's most efficient, and along this, it's most fair, and it leads to better policies, it leads to the best way to assure that the interests of different groups are taken into account and that minorities are also heard and that it's not only majority. So the functional idea, but for me, that is an important one. We should value democracy because it's very functional in very different ways, but also the normative aspect. Even if it's not functional, there's some value in there. There's some normative idea that appeals to us. So it's valuable on sich in itself, next to it is functional.
Yeah. Okay. I think we should conclude here. I will want to thank everyone for showing up. This is quite an abstract debate with tangible dimensions in real societies, but still there was a big turnout. There were very many questions. Thank you to the 4 speakers, and maybe I can conclude with asking you for an applause for them. Thank you.